We are back to recording these for YouTube, so anybody watching at home after the fact, I'm Codie Eash, Director of Education and Interpretation here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. And welcome to the first of our fall Fridays on the Ridge programs that we're going to have over the next few weeks here in the Lydia Ziegler-Clare Education Center. If you've listened carefully, it's just sort of been in the background, but I've had on the TV so far, the past 15 minutes or so, is a rotation of several renditions of the song John Brown's Body, which will play a major role in the topic at hand here this afternoon, a song very important to Union soldiers and veterans after the fact. And of course, the namesake of the talk this afternoon, His Soul's Marching On, comes as a lyric from that tune. But if anybody was listening along or is curious, there were 9 renditions that have been playing, ranging from 1903 to 1966. 1903, there's a nice preserved version, so you figure almost 130 years old or so, from William Steff and J.W. Myers. A 1913 version from the American Quartet. A 1915 version from Conway's Band. A 1931 version from Bob and Alf Pearson. A 1958 version from Grandma Moses. Another 1958 version from Paul Robeson. A 1965 version from Don Randy. A 1966 version from Pete Seeger, which I think is what's on right now. And then lastly, there's a 1966 version from Langston Hughes. And so that's going to be a major theme, is how important this song was and has continued to be in forming a certain version of the memory of John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry, which was happening 166 years ago right now. It started on October 16th, 1859. We oftentimes associate that day singularly with it, but that's just the beginning of the raid. But it'll be ongoing for about 48 hours until ultimately Brown and others are arrested and imprisoned following October 18th, when they're captured inside the fire engine house at the Harpers Ferry Arsenal by, of course, Robert E. Lee, among other federal troops who are there. So the focus that I have for this afternoon is not going to be on the raid itself. This is not going to be a straightforward, what did John Brown do? What was the course of his life? We're going to touch on that in a moment, just so we can all be certainly on the same page. But what I want to focus on is what the impact of John Brown and his raid, what impact did that have on Union veterans in the aftermath of the Civil War? And we're going to take a look in a couple of slides at what sort of sources that I want to look at this afternoon. But we're not really looking at the raid itself, Brown's story itself. We're looking at the impact of what he did, and we're talking about in the long term, in the aftermath of the Civil War. How does this hold up alongside memory of the war itself? And I think a great place for us to begin is actually with Brown's last moments. On December 2nd, 1859, he is about to be hanged, executed for the crime of treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. Of course, as we'll see, there's no shortage of Union veterans who see irony in the fact that John Brown is going to be accused of treason, given what follows in the aftermath of his raid and the war that follows. But it is going to be this incredibly premonitory line that Brown famously will write down and hand to one of the guards at the jail as he is about to be hanged. And it is written in part here with a lot of underlines for emphasis in Brown's own writing. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. And what we're going to look at today is the people who did the bloodletting in the aftermath of Brown's demise. The people who, as he predicted, would indeed go to war. But that would be the only way that slavery, the great crime of the land, as Brown calls it, would ultimately face its own demise, just like he is going to be through the course of a 4-year American Civil War. And so what I want to look at is how these people who were responsible for the bleeding and the dying and the killing of this war, how did this fit into their own personal memories of their service in the American Civil War? Now, a lot of historians have focused on these last words. It's a good place to start because it's such a poetic line that Brown gives us. It's as if he is reading a book on the American Civil War and knows what's going to happen. But of course, it hasn't happened yet. It's still hanging in the balance for another couple of years by that point in time. Here's just a handful of selections from ranging from the early 20th century to the early 21st century. The esteemed black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an entire book on John Brown. And in his words, he says that Brown's last written words constituted the mightiest abolition document that America has known, authored with such dramatic intensity that they did more to shake the foundations of slavery than any single thing that ever happened in America. So Du Bois, a generation later, is going to look back on Brown's final words and say that those are the most important words ever spoken against slavery in the history of the United States. In the words of Bruce Catton in This Hallowed Ground, a book, of course, not entirely about Brown's raid, but it plays a prominent role in the opening pages of the book. This is a single volume of Catton's that focuses on the entirety of the Union War effort. Catton says, "It was as if Brown had looked ahead to the war from the shadow of the hangman's noose." He's writing this 100 years after for the Civil War centennial. And personally, my favorite book on Brown and the raid, Midnight Rising by the late Tony Horwitz. He says in his 21st century retelling of the raid that sparked the Civil War that Brown foretold this carnage in an apocalyptic prophecy when he wrote that the crimes of this guilty land will be purged but with blood. And in a book with this provocative cover here of course, Brown hanging in this sort of folk art-esque style, R. Blakesley Gilpin, most recently, has said that the ubiquitous Union marching song, John Brown's Body, was a common trend in many U.S. soldiers' wartime writings. And so we're going to take a look at how historians have the people about whom these historians are writing, these Union veterans, how did they put it into their words. Now, the book on the left-hand side there is the most complete entire collection of first-hand accounts related to Brown and his raid. It goes from literally the days that the raid is happening all the way through at least 50 years later. I forget exactly how far after the fact, but edited by John Stauffer and Zoe Trott. It's called Responses to John Brown and the Harpers Ferry Raid is the subtitle of this book. If anybody's curious, it's like 700-800 pages. It's a big, thick one, but it is a wonderful collection of first-hand accounts. And in the introduction of that book, they write that as one of the most contentious figures in American culture, a national symbol embodying contradictions, Americans have continued to view Brown's legacy and his relation to American values with a deep sense of ambivalence. For some, he has been the nation's archetypal freedom fighter. For most, a dangerous fanatic, to be relegated to the historical dustbin with a core of other easily forgotten quixotic madmen. And Brown is one of those figures who is right up there with the likes of Robert E. Lee. To some extent, we could say even someone like Ulysses S. Grant, where if you throw that name into a room of people who are passionate about the Civil War, they're going to have 100 different opinions ranging all over the place. I would say that none is more controversial than John Brown. But what all of the historians we've just taken a look at have not done to any great degree, as far as I can tell, and quite surprisingly so, is taken a look through this aspect of veterans. They've looked at politicians of the era. They take hundreds of examples of what major leaders of the day, both black and white, both abolitionist and pro-slavery, both American and internationally, and they give us a sense of what people are thinking. What are the discussions surrounding Brown of the day? But very rarely have people taken that one step further and looking at the people, taking a look at the people who actually did the bleeding in this war. So here are 3 examples of the types of sources that I want to look at this afternoon. First, we're going to look at regimental histories, which are these curious documents in the course of American historiography. Alan Gelzo, a name known to many of you, he calls it that most peculiar of American literary genres, is the regimental history, as he says. And it's these, of course, incredible documents that are written by Civil War veterans, in some cases right after the war. We see a smattering of regimental histories starting in the late 1860s. But for the most part, they coincide with that period when people start to get nostalgic in general, that 25th, 30th, 35th anniversary, when people start going back to high school reunions, when military veterans start holding reunions on battlefields, just as Civil War veterans did. That's when we start to see a lot of these regimental histories taking shape. What did veterans say in those? Then we're going to look at monument dedication speeches. These are mostly from that 25 to 35 years afterward. This is why a lot of these units are having reunions on battlefields, is because they're dedicating their monuments. And we're mostly going to look at Gettysburg, but we're going to take a look at Antietam, which of course has a deep symbolic relation to Brown and his raid in many ways, as we will see. But also on a few other battlefields, faraway places in the Western theater of the war, where every now and again we'll see a veteran reflect upon Brown. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at a couple of memoirs. And this is especially where we see that there are going to be higher ranking officers. Here's an example of the autobiography of Oliver Otis Howard, but also William Sherman, Ulysses S. Grant. They don't tell us a lot about their feelings on John Brown until they write these influential memoirs in the decades after the war, and in Grant's case, in literally the final days of his life. So let's just all get on the same page very briefly about John Brown. Born in 1800, he's a native of Connecticut. Going to be probably best known, most infamous, depending on one's perspective, because of what he does during Bleeding Kansas. He gets on this raid of sorts during that violence, of course, in the debate over the Nebraska and Kansas, Missouri and Kansas territories, excuse me. And there he's going to earn the nickname Osawatomie Brown. He's going to be seen by many as a slaughterer, others as a freedom fighter. But it's going to be when he really develops this sort of national name recognition, using this sort of Old Testament-esque fire, this religious fervor, where he's going to go on this anti-slavery crusade, is how he sees it. But he's also going to become friends with some rather mainstream anti-slavery voices, people like Frederick Douglass, who Brown goes to visit at Douglass's home in Rochester, the home of this formerly enslaved man. And in the aftermath of Kansas, and as he's preparing for the raid at Harpers Ferry, Brown is going to meet with Douglass, famously just west of us in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, while Brown is secretly hiding there, is gathering up some of his tools, some of his men, some of his materiel. He's trying to encourage Frederick Douglass to join him in a raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. And as Douglass famously says, you're going to go into a perfect steel trap. And that's exactly what happens, of course, for Brown. Douglass does not join him, but Douglass will be a major figure who we're not going to hear much from today, just based on the fact that I'm mostly focusing on veterans, but we could spend at least an hour just talking about all of the things that Douglass did to maintain a certain version of the memory of John Brown. But it's going to be in the months before October 1859 where we really start to see Brown ramping up with this plan to raid the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. And he sees this as the first step in a series of actions that he believes will start a slave insurrection, freeing enslaved people in the South, moving through what was then Virginia, today is part of West Virginia, of course comes out of the American Civil War, establishing statehood in 1863. Right there at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac Rivers, this important mountainside town that will change hands dozens of times throughout the course of the Civil War. Even before the conflict itself develops, Brown and others recognize its strategic importance, and ultimately, as a result of his raid, we'll see the symbolic importance over time as well. If you've never been to Harpers Ferry, has anybody been to Harpers Ferry? I'm sure many in this audience have, if not everyone, yeah. Of course, an absolutely picturesque location. And we can see that going back to the colonial era. Thomas Jefferson famously at Jefferson's Rock talking about the beauty of this valley, and even to this day that continues, even outside of its historical significance, just in terms of its picturesque nature, especially around this time of year in autumn, just an absolutely beautiful location. But strategic, a rail location, home of a federal arsenal. Brown sees that there might be an opportunity at having some success here in this daring plan. He begins on the night of October 16th, so 166 years ago last night. And then right now, he would have been under siege, if you will, at the engine house, which becomes known as John Brown's Fort, which becomes an extraordinarily important setting in the course of our story. It's a place that a lot of Civil War soldiers go during the war when they're stationed at Harpers Ferry. They want to see where John Brown held out against in the midst of his raid. And then ultimately, he's going to face arrest on October 18th, as we mentioned, Robert E. Lee being part of that arresting party. But that just gets us on the same page as far as Brown's raid is concerned. Now, there's one brief direct connection that we can tie to this building And this doesn't really fit the topic directly at hand for this afternoon, but it's worth noting because this man, Reverend Josiah Pierce Smeltzer, I can't find a photograph of him, unfortunately, but the church that you see on the left-hand side of this image here, this is a wartime photo taken, I believe, in 1862 of the Company A of the 22nd New York State Militia. This is St. John's Lutheran Church right outside of Harpers Ferry proper. And Josiah Smeltzer is the pastor there, and he was a graduate of the Gettysburg Seminary. He was a graduate of Pennsylvania College and a graduate of the seminary. He entered the institution in 1847. And there's a Civil War Trails wayside marker at this church today. It still stands today. And there's a quote on there from his diary which says, "I never witnessed such a fright in any community as when the news fled that the abolitionists of the North had taken the armory and were killing our people." And so we can see that despite being this graduate of a northern seminary operated by an anti-slavery minister in the form of Samuel Simon Schmucker, he is more, by this point in time at least, Reverend Smeltzer is much more aligned with the people of Virginia, sees himself as a Virginia, sees abolitionists as something of an enemy, especially when it comes to this violent sort of abolitionism that John Brown is perpetrating on that occasion. But an important connection we can tie directly between the building where we are right now. He would have studied here about a decade plus before the raid on Harpers Ferry itself, and then he's a witness to it. John Brown, after being arrested, is going to be imprisoned in Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia, of course, from October 19th to December 2nd, 1859. He's going to be, as a result of the raid itself, he had been wounded, he's sick, he's bedridden for most of this trial. It takes on sort of a trial of the century sort of aura around it. Newspapers, small and large, across the entire United States are going to cover it. There are a million editorials, or so, not literally, but tens of thousands of editorials. Every newspaper editor, every politician, everybody who is running in the presidential election of 1860, they all have something to say about their thoughts on John Brown. And this is a scene in the courthouse itself in Charlestown. Here is Brown lying on his cot. This becomes a prominent feature of these drawings that are created as a result of this period. Bear in mind as well, we have a few settings that will be important to Union veterans. I mentioned John Brown's fort, the fire engine house, but also the jail where he was imprisoned, and the courthouse itself, and just next to that, the site of the hanging. All of these will become these incredibly symbolic places for Union veterans in the aftermath of the war. I'm going to play a clip here of John Brown's final testimony in court on November 2nd, 1859, so a month before he's killed. If you've never seen the entire thing, it's about 5 minutes long on YouTube, but there's this incredible, I'm going to show you a clip of about 30 seconds here. There's this incredible recreation of this speech by David Strathairn, the actor David Strathairn, who coincidentally would go on to become William Seward in Steven Spielberg's Lincoln film. But we're just going to listen to about 30 seconds of this, and we can see why this becomes an incredibly important document to Union veterans and to many Northerners throughout the course of this period. This is a piece of a series of these first-person recreations of important American documents that are done with Howard Zinn. He did a history project where he has several rather prominent actors read these, recite these famous American speeches and other documents. And Strathairn does a nice job of about a 5-minute piece of John Brown's final testimony. It gives you a little bit of a taste of it there. But many of these scenes are going to inspire a lot of art that is created in the late 19th and into the early 21st, or into the early 20th centuries, as we will see, including some that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then his execution takes place exactly a month after that final testimony, on December 2nd, 1859, on that occasion when he writes that note that he feels as though the crimes of this land can never be purged away but with blood. Likewise, Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's, other prominent period papers are going to have sketches of the hanging itself, and we can see even editorializing in the form of some of the cartoons that are created, such as this one, which is ominously titled The Traitor's Doom. This is published just before the American Civil War, and it's surrounded by all of these images of pieces throughout Brown's life. And I should have included the entire thing. It's quite a large image, but at the top of it, there is this sort of demonic figure, might even be the devil himself, looming over everything. And then at the very bottom of this image, there is this crying woman who is sort of hunkered down over top of a grave, and she's surrounded by this arch. And there are pieces of the arch that are crumbling, but there's a keystone that remains intact. And we can read into that it's a symbol that the nation is beginning to break apart. People are realizing that John Brown's raid is an incredibly significant moment. And it will create many of these incredibly famous pieces of art. Probably most famous would be this one here on the right-hand side of this fiery Brown, of course, beard flowing by this point in time, no longer clean-shaven, with all of these images surrounding him of what will come of a nation at war. And so we will see that, of course, the crimes of this guilty land purged with blood, as Brown says, that's exactly what's going to happen, as we know, from 1861 to 1865. Now, involving veterans themselves, there are innumerable examples of, during the war, how people are going to treat Brown and his legacy as they're still fighting this conflict. And that's where I wanted to go with this project at first, until I realized that there are just way too many examples of wartime letters and diaries where people invoke the memory of John Brown. So I decided to go by mostly focusing on its aftermath. But sort of a good way that I think is a segue into thinking about how people viewed Brown is to go to the roughly midpoint of the war. Emancipation Proclamation has been enacted. And we have this very famous moment of this iconic regiment, the 54th Massachusetts, a black unit, the first one raised in the North in United States military. And it's this scene that plays out in the movie Glory. So we're going to take a quick look at this scene and then zoom into a particular piece of this that we can find in the historic record. So the movie Glory, of course, is about the raising of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. It includes a lot of fictionalized aspects. For instance, none of the enlisted men are actually real people. Some are composite characters. Some of these scenes are based on actual events, most famously the attack upon Fort Wagner at the great climax of the film, but also this scene of the regiment marching through Boston. Now, in this scene, we see this sort of fictionalized version of this stand that has several people looking on, including Frederick Douglass, most prominently, as we could see in this particular scene. But in reality, there is also in the historic record from a black newspaperman named William Nell, who is going to report in the days after this has happened that there's this interesting event that takes place at the home of Wendell Phillips, pictured on the left-hand side there, and Phillips is in his doorway there, famous abolitionist leader from Boston. And standing at the home of Wendell Phillips, watching the 54th Massachusetts parade by in this great symbolic moment, is going to be William Lloyd Garrison, the famed abolitionist editor of The Liberator, initially going to be the man who sort of makes Frederick Douglass a rather household name in the immediate aftermath of Douglass's escape from slavery. I'll allow William Nell to narrate what happens next. On Essex Street, on the balcony of Wendell Phillips' residence, was conspicuously placed a bust of John Brown. Beside, resting his hand upon its head, stood William Lloyd Garrison. The associations suggested by the scene should be embodied by the artist as a fitting souvenir of the historic day. We witnessed 1,000 armed colored American soldiers en route for the land of slavery, marching down State Street, the band playing, the soldiers singing John Brown, all indicating the free, the happy future, a scene that marks an era in the history of colored Americans, the significance of which no language can adequately portray. Black soldiers marching to the South to go fight slavery as a team of abolitionists are standing on the balcony of Wendell Phillips with one of them resting his hand upon the head of a bust of John Brown. Talk about a chock-full scene of symbolism that encompasses like the entirety of the Civil War era right there in one moment. And I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find many scenes much like that. Famous figure here, I'm sure for many of you, if you've seen Ken Burns's The Civil War series, prominent voice throughout is Elisha Hunt Rhodes of the 2nd Rhode Island. Elisha Hunt Rhodes tells us in his widely quoted All for the Union, which is a journal and diary that's not published until later, sort of as a memoir with his journal entries throughout. He talks about how during the war in August 1864, we left Harpers Ferry and marched to this camp passing through Charlestown, the place where John Brown was hung, and we each had band and drum corps play. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on as we pass through the streets of the town. The men joined in singing the hymn, much to the disgust of the people. I saw at Harper's Ferry the engine house where John Brown was captured, and at Charlestown the spot where his execution took place. And then a few months later, he says they're passing through Hanover Courthouse, Virginia, near Richmond, and a party of colored children sang John Brown to us as we marched along. And so we can see the symbolism of the song itself. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, but his soul is marching on. Soldiers singing it, enslaved children singing it to those soldiers. Men wanting to visit the place where John Brown was imprisoned, the place where he faced his trial, the place where he was executed, the place where the raid took place. Even as the war is happening and these men are on these important missions, as they're campaigning from battle to battle, they still realize where they are, if they realize that they're in the vicinity of where John Brown and his compatriots worked. Another good example of this is Homer Spragg of the 13th Connecticut. It's a very early post-war regimental history. It's published in 1867. So just 2 years after the war. And coincidentally and fittingly, this regiment, I have an image on the next slide here, is raised about 45 minutes away from where Brown had been born in Torrington, Connecticut. These men are raised in New Haven, home of Yale. In the 2nd chapter of this book, he chronicles this story that takes place here, which is at the Mint in New Orleans. This is in the 2nd year of the war in 1862. And he says that there's this betting man whose name is Mumford. He's a Confederate sympathizer. And he's hanged in New Orleans during the war for endeavoring to excite insurrection by tearing down the U.S. flag from the top of the Mint after the surrender of the city to Union forces. And Sprague, the author, he says, in this stoical indifference, without a prayer on his lips, Mumford met death as coolly as did old John Brown on the Virginia scaffold. But Brown was a man of a different mold, of austere morals, trained to piety, accustomed to spend much of his time in reading his Bible or on his knees in prayer. Mumford was conceited to have no religious convictions, was dissolute, intemperate, a noted gambler, poor material to exalt into a martyr, even in the cause of slavery for which he died. And so we can see that these men are witnessing these events that seemingly have absolutely no connection to John Brown. And yet the moment that they see that there's a Confederate sympathizer who is hanged, the first place that Sprague's mind goes is this man is standing there dying just like John Brown did, and he's making this comparison, but then he immediately contrasts that. And he says that, we could believe as Union veterans in the cause for which Brown died. We cannot believe in the cause for which this betting man, this rebel sympathizer, this sinful figure who is not reading his Bibles like John Brown did, we can see that they're dying for completely different causes, even if they're dying in the same way. He'll later then recall, does Sprague, in this same writing, and here we can see a map in Connecticut, the regiment is raised not far away from where Brown had been born. The image on the right-hand side is the jailhouse. You can see the bars down at the lower window here where Brown had been imprisoned. And he says that when they passed through this area in September 1864, the 13th Connecticut left its place of bivouac, marched rapidly forward. We passed the jail where John Brown was confined, the courthouse where he had his trial as he lay bleeding and helpless, the field rendered forever historic by the offering of his life for the liberty of the African race. 5 years had not passed, but the edict of freedom for that race had been proclaimed at Washington, and 1,000,000 bayonets were putting it in force. The martyr's body lay moldering in his lowly grave at North Elba, New York, but with what gigantic strides his soul is marching on. So again and again and again, we see these examples where these men are remembering in the immediate aftermath of the war that some of the key moments that they can recall on the march are when they're moving through anywhere that had to do with John Brown. And the song, of course, is something that you would have heard as these men were making their way. This is Pete Seeger's version again. But The song is going to inspire Julia Ward Howe to create Battle Hymn of the Republic, its more famous version to us today. And it's one of the rare songs in American history that entire books have been written about, and several of them at that. The most substantial, I would say, is simply called the Battle Hymn of the Republic by John Stauffer and Benjamin Soskis. They write that before Julia Ward Howe wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, it was John Brown's Body, the popular song that wielded even more power. Even Northerners who had not marked his death with a special commemoration would soon help ensure his immortality by intoning its opening lines. Richard Gamble, in the second book there, A Fiery Trial, he says the soldiers' rendition of the John Brown song inspired Howe to write her own war anthem when she heard soldiers singing the John Brown song. Franny Noodleman, in the book John Brown's Body, the third one from the left there, she detailed the literal process of decomposition through which Brown's actual body was transformed into a diffuse, inspiriting presence. In that way, U.S. soldiers and veterans reflected on his corpse and other dead bodies, and they attached figurative meanings to them. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. Here are soldiers who have seen their friends, their comrades, by the hundreds, soldiers on battlefields dying and decomposing, and here they are singing this song about this man and his literal body who had been killed and had sacrificed himself, as they see it, as a martyr for the Union cause. Even people who are by no means in agreement with this, like Jubal Early, Confederate general, he even is going to note at one point in time that he heard bands playing at soldiers singing John Brown's Body Goes Marching On. John Brown's mission was subsequently but too well carried out in Virginia and all the southern states under the inspiration of that anthem. Even though he is a Confederate sympathizer, Confederate general, burns Thaddeus Stevens' ironworks just west of Gettysburg because Stevens is an abolitionist congressman, even he recognizes the power of this song in inspiring Union soldiers and veterans. Famous figure here who fought just west of us on McPherson and Seminary Ridges, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin. We often sang the John Brown song, he says. And he even says that he was present. He remembered being present at the Union encampment at Arlington, the former home of Robert E. Lee and now the home of Arlington National Cemetery, when he recalled a visitor coming to the camp in 1861. Julia Ward Howe, our visitor, has said that the singing of the John Brown song by soldiers there and the scenes of that day and evening inspired her to the composition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We helped to swell the chorus, says Dawes. Orson Curtis, another Iron Brigade regiment that served here on McPherson and Seminary Ridges, the 24th Michigan. He'll have an entire image of Brown in the course of the 24th Michigan regimental history. Books about the regiment's service during the course of the Civil War, and they're going to dedicate one of rather few images in the course of these books. They decide that one of their images they want is of John Brown. Had nothing to do with their fighting force, is not from Michigan, has no direct connection, as far as I know, to the men of this regiment. But when he's detailing the reason for their enlistments, the reason for their service, he lists John Brown as one of those and includes John Brown's image in the process as well. He tells this story where he says that on June 13th, 1889, when they're here in Gettysburg to dedicate their monument out on McPherson Ridge, the regiment decides that it wants to take a trip a little further south. And they decide they're going to go to Antietam and to Harpers Ferry. And he says that we spent 2 hours in Harpers Ferry, affording a fine view of Maryland and Loudoun Heights and the scene of John Brown's raid 30 years before. The engine house in which he sought refuge and was captured by Robert E. Lee has been mostly carried away by relic hunters. Even veterans who doubted Brown's sanity nevertheless appreciated the spectacle of his actions and felt the need to visit the scenes where he carried out his deeds. So here's an image from the aftermath. About 30 years later, this is taken, and we can see it's been written on. And of course, by this point, as some of you might know, the building itself has traveled around several times. It's today back in Harpers Ferry, but even it still is not in the actual position it was during the raid itself. It's a little further down toward the river. It had moved around to several locations, including the Storer College in Harpers Ferry, but all over the country as well before it's brought back. And we can see that there are signs on it. This one is a sale of lots. It's an advertisement for selling lots. We can see it literally is written on John Brown's fort. 2 of these doors appear to be actually boarded up. So it's in pretty rough condition because so many veterans and general visitors are actually just taking pieces of it away. When here were some Gettysburg veterans who were visiting it after they visited Gettysburg first. This is Jacob Manning. He was a congregational minister at Boston's Old South Church, and he eventually becomes the wartime chaplain of the 43rd Massachusetts Infantry, and had been a wartime recruiter for the regiment as well. Going back to before the war, he remembered that he was at a service with the family of John Brown in the illustrious Tremont Temple, famous venue in Boston. He says that he opined that Brown performed an unlawful, foolhardy, and suicidal act, but I believe he is a good man and has been doing with that which he thought was right. The only explanation I can now give is that he was an instrument of providence. God has used this man, John Brown, as his sword to inflict a wound on the slave power. So we can see here even chaplains are jumping into this mix of trying to understand, make sense of, interpret what John Brown did and the impact that he had upon the nation. Another man from that regiment, Edward Rogers, likewise from the 43rd Massachusetts. He'll write in 1883 a regimental history for this regiment. And in one passage, he recalls speaking with a soldier from another regiment, from the 9th New Jersey. And he says that this soldier from the 9th New Jersey shows him his rifle, and he comments, "I know I've killed 3 rebels with this today." These words were uttered with an earnestness and intensity of feeling which would have done good credit to John Brown. And so soldiers are using inspiration from John Brown for the killing that they're doing of Confederate soldiers. They're thinking about John Brown literally on the battlefield as they're firing their rifles. He writes about the regiment's participation in the state of North Carolina, so far away from Brown's raid. And he remembers many a patriotic ode or hymn taken up by all who could sing. Whatever else was sung, the martyr hero who pioneered our great conflict was sure to be remembered. The soul of John Brown went marching on with us, as with every armed column which penetrated secession. Now, at Tremont Temple, where he likewise is going to give a speech, much like the chaplain we heard from in the line before, he's going to quote some poetry from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he's also going to intone the memory of Daniel Webster on the right-hand side there, the image that we see. Does anybody know where this image of Daniel Webster is taken from? What piece of statuary are we looking at?
Monument.
The monument here at Gettysburg. Yep, just up on Oak Ridge, the Webster Regiment. So it's a good tie into the Webster Regiment, the 12th Massachusetts. So his image appears on the monument. Fletcher Webster, Daniel Webster, the great statesman, his son, commands the regiment. Here we have an image tying in with this of the 12th Massachusetts at the beginning of the war, beginning of its service, receiving its regimental flag. And can anybody tell by the image who it is who is handing it off to him there?
Andrew Johnson?
Not Andrew Johnson. Edward Everett. So eventually, of course, the keynote speaker before Lincoln at the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery. Edward Everett, of course, the punchline of many of our jokes here in Gettysburg, but in the moment, an extraordinarily influential figure, especially in New England. In 1882, when we will see Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Cook write the regimental history for the 12th Massachusetts, he talks about, likewise, like so many of these other veterans, the band striking up John Brown, the men starting to sing, citizens electrified by the seemingly weird chorus, as he talks about it. And he says that they will encourage people through the streets of New York City as they pass by, Baltimore as they pass through, and several other towns and cities. As they're making their way through these towns, they will get the people of these cities to just start singing John Brown's body. And so you can imagine these scenes of Union soldiers making their way through northern cities, and suddenly the populace is starting to sing this famous tune. Some members of the 1st Minnesota in a later regimental history, published in 1916. We're going to see 3 men who will write several accounts that they sort of compile together. Jasper Searles, pictured on the left-hand side there. Matthew Taylor, second one over, and William Loughran on the right-hand side of the three of them there. They'll talk about this moment, how during the war our regiment crossed the Potomac on a pontoon bridge near Harpers Ferry, quartering that night in some of the partially destroyed government buildings formerly connected with the Harpers Ferry arsenal. These were examined with interest, especially those said to have been connected with John Brown's raid. We were quartered in the buildings in which John Brown and his partisans had attempted defense. They literally stay inside of John Brown's fort as best they could recall when they're writing about this more than 50 years later. And so here we have the unit that by many accounts takes the highest percent of losses at the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, nearly a year before Gettysburg, had apparently slept inside of John Brown's fort, inside the engine house in Harpers Ferry. Now, how about on battlefields? Let's take a look at some battlefield examples of veterans who come back to these fields and talk about Brown in the course of their monument dedications. Now, in these three examples, all three New Jersey regiments, they don't use Brown's name directly, but they're basically speaking the exact same language, if you will, as Brown. In one case, John Ramsey, who is going to dedicate the monument on the left-hand side there, which is the 2nd New Jersey, I believe. He says, "This is a land of freemen, that the shackles of slaves should be sold for old iron, that the auction block should be burned." Samuel Buck is going to say in another monument dedication that on the free soil of Gettysburg, he and his comrades struck the shackles from 4 millions of slaves. Henry Sawyer of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, he pointed to the ground when he said this, and he said that in those graves where we laid our comrades, here too we bury the shackles of the slaves. And so if John Brown's spirit is being invoked by many of these veterans, if John Brown were present for some of these monument dedications, he's seeing that these men are speaking the same language 25 years or so after, in this case, the Battle of Gettysburg. In this case, we have another interesting instance here of John Farrington. And in 1888, he gives this example of remembering that as the unit made its way through Charlestown, Virginia, during our first reconnaissance into the enemy's lines with our division, the troops were much interested in the town because of its notoriety as the place of the trial and execution of John Brown. As the regiment was marching by, the writer, meaning himself, talking about himself in the third person, rode his horse into the courthouse, up to the judge's stand, and out at the other front door, much to the amusement of the boys, but also to the unexpressed indignation of the residents, who regarded the act as one of desecration to their hall of justice. And so here, Dr. Farrington, regimental surgeon, is talking about the fact that as they're passing through Charlestown, his bit of protest, if you will, the way he wants to make a demonstration against the fact that John Brown had been tried for treason and executed, he rides his horse into the courthouse where Brown had been tried a few years earlier, and right up to the front of the courtroom. Another example here in Gettysburg, John Danks, the former commanding officer of the 63rd Pennsylvania 3rd Corps Regiment, at its monument dedication, September 11th, 1889, Pennsylvania Day, which some of you have heard me talk about that occasion before. He says that Gettysburg was the Calvary of American freedom, the rare example in Gettysburg where it is the correct use of Calvary, C-A-L-V-A-R-Y, and not cavalry. Gettysburg was the Calvary of American freedom. When we think of humanity as being crushed by sin and look for a remedy, we begin at the Garden of Eden and find the conclusion at Calvary. When we think and speak of the government of England as threatened with dismemberment and ruin and look for the remedy, we find it at Waterloo. And then he concludes with this line: "So when we think and speak of oppression, class, and caste in America and look for the remedy, we begin at Harper's Ferry with old John Brown and find the answer in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So we say, for humanity, Calvary; for England, Waterloo; for America, Gettysburg." So he sees the great climax of the American Civil War, its effective conclusion, if we're thinking about this in literal terms. He says it doesn't begin at Fort Sumter and end at Appomattox. We have to think about this in terms of liberty. He says it begins symbolically with John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and it ends with the repulsive Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Now, historically, we could take up an argument as far as whether he's correct or not, but as far as a veteran looking back on his experience and what he feels as the symbolic beginning and end of American slavery, he looks at John Brown at Harper's Ferry and Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. J.C. Truesdale, who I could I have literally spent an hour just talking about him before, gives this amazing speech where he goes on talking about what the Civil War means to veterans nearly 30 years after the fact. And in part, he says, "You remember the song we used to sing in Virginia and make the pine woods ring with the echo of it." And I can imagine that he's probably just starts singing to the members of the Regimental Association who are there. But he quotes, "John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on." This is an incredible speech. I'm sure I'll talk about it again if you've never heard me talk about it. But if you go look up J.C. Truesdale, he was the regimental chaplain of the 105th Pennsylvania. Little taste of it there. Now on other battlefields, as we wind down here away from Gettysburg, at the Antietam battlefield in 1904, we see their version of Pennsylvania Day. Several Pennsylvania monuments are dedicated on September 17th, the anniversary of the battle in 1904. Samuel Pennypacker, someone with a Gettysburg connection, who had been in the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Militia just west of town, June 26, 1863, has become governor of Pennsylvania by this point in time. He will stand on ground not far from the Kennedy Farm, which is where Brown, on the outskirts of Sharpsburg and Harpers Ferry, had actually planned the final stages of the raid on Harpers Ferry in 1859. Pennypacker tells his audience when he dedicates his monument that Maryland's people at their demonstrations sing, "Maryland, my Maryland." And he goes on to say, at Antietam National Cemetery, "And doubtless it occurs when we have our demonstrations here, we sing the old song of John Brown." So he's saying this is the unifying veterans memorial song, is John Brown's body. And Dr. S.M. Whistler, who was a veteran of the 130th Pennsylvania, likewise speaking at Antietam, he describes this scene that played out in this famous painting of John Brown kissing this child, this black child, as he's making his way down the steps on his way to execution in December 2nd, 1859. He quotes a bit of poetry, does S.M. Whistler, this veteran, from John Greenleaf Whittier. He reads a couple of stanzas. I won't read the entirety. But one of them is that John Brown of Osawatomie, they led him out to die, and lo, a poor slave mother with her little child passed nigh. Then the bold blue eye grew tender, and the old harsh face grew mild, as he stooped between the crowding ranks and kissed the Negro's child. And so we can see how more and more directly at a place like Antietam, which is the battle, of course, in 1862 that inspires Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, those veterans don't have to stretch very far at all to see that there's an exact correlation between the legacy of John Brown and the death of slavery upon the battlefield where they dedicated those monuments. And Joseph Matchett, who will be further away at Chattanooga, Tennessee, dedicating his regiment's monument, the 46th Pennsylvania, in 1897. He says that he remembered a moment when his comrades speeded up the Potomac through historic Harpers Ferry, where old John Brown opened the war, and near which place the poor old patriot was hanged by the Virginia chivalry in 1859. A couple of examples here then to totally close out here, where we can see that some of these higher-ranking officers of the war, men who commanded armies in each of these cases, they will reflect upon Brown in their own personal autobiographies and memoirs. Oliver Otis Howard, of course, of 11th Corps fame here at Gettysburg, who I'll be talking about the speech in a few weeks for one of these programs that he delivers at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Monument, Cornerstone, in 1865, by which time he was chairman of the Freedmen's Bureau. But he remembers in 1907, when he had written his autobiography, looking back over the course of 40-plus years, he says that at the Battle of First Bull Run, at the beginning of the war, that his men retreated after getting started, went swinging along, singing John Brown's body with a wonderful volume of sound. So Howard remembers that unlike most of these veterans who say that this was a cheerful marching song as they're going to battle, he says that literally as his men are retreating off the battlefield of First Bull Run, that's when they decide they're going to inspire themselves by singing John Brown. William Sherman, likewise, is going to write a bit about John Brown. Of course, Sherman is almost as far away from an abolitionist as you could get among Union generals during the course of the Civil War. But he talks about how during the movement southeast of Atlanta, during the March to the Sea, some band by accident, which I think is a peculiar couple of words he uses there, struck up the anthem of John Brown's soul goes marching on. The men caught up the strain, and never before or since have I heard the chorus of glory, glory, hallelujah, done with more spirit or in better harmony of time and place. And Grant will devote an entire page to an image of John Brown, talks about how he has this sort of indirect familial connection. He talks about how a relation named Peter Grant had worked in Maysville, Kentucky. He worked for and lived in the family of a Mr. Brown, who was the father of John Brown. And so there's this sort of coincidental connection between one of Ulysses S. Grant's family connections, Peter Grant, who worked for and lived in the same house for a time as John Brown's father. And so kind of an interesting connection there that Grant feels he should mention in the course of his memoir. He also says this toward the conclusion of this section: I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events of Harpers Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but he knew him afterwards and regarded him as a man of great purity of character, of high moral and physical courage. But, there's always a but in these sort of sentences with John Brown, a fanatic and extremist in whatever he advocated. It was certainly the act of an insane man to attempt the invasion of the South and the overthrow of slavery with less than 20 men. That's Grant's feeling on that. So in examining a sample like we have here this afternoon of Civil War participants in their regimental histories, their monument dedication speeches, their memoirs, and other writings, Brown's influence is obvious. It's evident here. With it, we can see how much these men certainly felt that the Civil War's central cause was indisputably slavery, and emancipation was indisputably the Civil War's key result. He didn't live long enough, did Brown, to see the conflict that he predicted. Many would say that he had a key role in leading, prompting the nation to war. Soldiers felt Brown's presence and encouraged the act of keeping his memory alive. From private enlisted men all the way up to the man who commanded all the United States armies during the course of the war, U.S. veterans sang, spoke, and wrote Brown's name not just from 1861 to 1865, but in many cases until their dying days. Grant is publishing his memoir literally days, or he's finishing that memoir days before he passes. In churches, in courthouses, in camp and on the march, in veteran social halls, and on commemorative battlefield landscapes, Brown maintained a distinctive status as perhaps the single most consequential figure of the Civil War who did not see the Civil War. As such, through the lens of historical memory, the men who bore blue and bled red ensured that though John Brown's body lay moldering in the grave, his soul marched on with them for generations. To this day, we still continue to debate this. Thank you all very much.